Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're diving straight into an absolutely fascinating historical journey, how the vocabulary and the medical frameworks we use to understand human trauma have dramatically evolved over time. For a really long time, the profound psychological wounds of war and extreme stress were literally invisible to the medical community. Or, at the very least, they were entirely misunderstood. So today, we're going to look at how we finally learned to name the invisible.
Okay, let's start by rewinding a bit to the American Civil War. Now, this conflict was incredibly unique because it was one of the very first to be covered by designated war correspondents. So for the first time ever, the brutal, unvarnished reality of combat was being broadcast directly to the public. And out of this era, we start seeing these poetic but frankly medically vague terms popping up, things like soldier's heart and exhausted heart. It was essentially an early attempt to describe service members who were in severe distress. They were just grasping for words to capture an invisible injury.
So, here is our roadmap for today. We'll cover the early names of trauma, the crucial shift to focusing on the mind, how global wars shaped the very first DSMs, the actual birth of the PTSD diagnosis, and finally, how we're continuing to evolve that modern diagnosis today. Let's get into it.
Part 1. The early names of trauma. Let's look at how our understanding originally built up from those highly physical descriptions.
A really distinct trajectory emerges when we lay out how the military viewed combat stress across these major conflicts. We start with the Civil War and those cardiac-focused labels, like soldier's heart. Then, as we move into the heavy, industrialized warfare of the First World War, the terminology shifts to shell shock. But perhaps most strikingly, and honestly kind of shockingly, by the Second World War, we see terms like lack of moral fiber. You can really see how the language morphed from a physical description of the heart into something carrying a heavy, dismissive moral judgment.
Moving to Part 2, shifting to the mind. This is where the medical community frantically scrambled to define these conditions psychologically, realizing the problem wasn't exactly in the heart or somebody's moral fiber.
Look at this timeline. In less than 2 decades, during the late 19th century, clinicians introduced an absolute explosion of new terminology. We've got Neil's traumatic shock in 1882, Page's nervous shock just a few years later, moving into traumatic neuroses by Clevenger in 1889. And by the end of the century, heavyweights like Freud and Kraepelin enter the chat with anxiety neuroses and fright neuroses. Medical thinking was decisively and finally shifting toward the mind.
So the crucial point introduced by thinkers like Freud was this completely novel idea that a distressing, invisible psychological experience could actually manifest later on as physical symptoms. Think about what a massive conceptual leap that was. Freud proposed that trauma wasn't just a physical blow to the head. It was an overwhelming psychological experience repressed by the mind, only to bubble up later through what were then labeled as hysterical physical symptoms.
Which brings us to Part 3, Wars and the First DSMs. The sheer scale of 20th century warfare meant we desperately needed a way to systematically sort all of this out.
Early efforts at true medical standardization actually kicked off around 1917. What would eventually become the American Psychiatric Association got together to produce a statistical guide for mental hospitals. At the time, it was quite literally titled The Statistical Manual for the Use of Institutions for the Insane.
Now, amazingly, that original 1917 guide listed a grand total of only 22 recognized conditions. Just 22. When you consider the vast, intricate complexity of the human mind, that incredibly small number really highlights how rudimentary formal psychiatric classification was at the dawn of the 20th century.
But look at this staggering data jump. Following the Second World War, the U.S. military experienced this massive expansion of psychiatric involvement to screen service personnel. This wartime experience exposed a desperate need for a real, systematic framework. So, the first true Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, the DSM-1, was published in 1952, and it ballooned to include 160 disorders.
Right there, nestled inside that 1952 DSM-Y, was a critical stepping stone to our modern understanding. It was a condition they called gross stress reaction. Why is this such a game changer? Because it explicitly acknowledged that a severe reaction could develop in a psychologically stable individual when they were exposed to extreme battlefield stress. It completely tossed out the idea that you had to have some pre-existing weakness. It acknowledged that extreme environments can, and do, break completely stable minds.
When we compare those first 2 editions, we see the manual expanding pretty quickly. By 1968, the DSM-2 grew to 182 disorders. What's really notable here is the organization. The DSM-2 grouped many newly defined conditions, like various anxiety and depressive states, under the umbrella of neuroses. They were categorized as non-psychotic disorders tied to life stressors, creating a really clear dividing line between those conditions and severe psychotic illnesses like schizophrenia.
All right, part 4, the birth of PTSD. This organizational groundwork we just talked about sets the stage for a monumental turning point.
It actually wasn't until 1980, with the publication of the DSM-3, that post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD, was formally introduced as an official diagnosis. This was a massive paradigm shift for the medical community. It finally provided a concrete, actionable label for individuals who had experienced an event considered outside ordinary human experience.
To actually meet the criteria for this brand new PTSD diagnosis, an individual had to show patterns across 4 distinct categories. First, a persistent re-experiencing of the trauma, intrusive memories, flashbacks, or distressing dreams. Second, the active avoidance of trauma-related thoughts or situations. Third, a distinct sense of emotional numbing or detachment. And finally, ongoing physiological arousal, meaning hypervigilance, sleep disturbance, or an exaggerated startle response. Defining these exact categories finally anchored the historical narrative in concrete medical criteria.
Now here's a fascinating historical footnote for you. The international rollout of this diagnosis wasn't exactly universally embraced overnight. Despite the major shift it represented in the United States, it generated surprisingly little immediate reaction over in the UK. In fact, some UK officials initially brushed off PTSD as just an American diagnostic construct, which just goes to show you that medical consensus doesn't always cross borders immediately.
Let's move into part 5, evolving the modern diagnosis. Let's look at how this framework has continued to sharpen up since that landmark introduction in 1980. Our understanding is always refining itself. In 2013, the DSM-5 actually pulled PTSD out of the anxiety disorders category entirely. It reorganized it under a brand new category: trauma and stressor-related disorders, placing a much heavier emphasis on negative changes in cognition and mood. That was followed up by the DSM-5-TR in 2022, which is our currently active edition today, bringing even more updated descriptive text and clinical details.
And honestly, this brilliantly illustrates a much larger modern shift in psychiatry. Rather than waiting decades for sweeping, monumental overhauls to the manual, the American Psychiatric Association now uses a continuous revision process. They update the manual periodically so it rapidly reflects the very latest in research, clinical knowledge, and even cultural understanding.
Because of this incredibly fluid, continuous updating process, there are actually no formal plans right now for a complete DSM-6 overhaul. The framework we have today is literally designed to live, breathe, and adapt right alongside our growing medical knowledge.
So, looking back at this incredible journey, from Civil War soldiers being vaguely diagnosed with exhausted hearts to our modern, continuously updated diagnostic manuals, I want to leave you with one final thought to chew on. As our understanding of the incredibly complex human mind continues to grow, how will the definition of trauma evolve next? Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer, and as always, keep questioning what you see.